My name is Jane Jenkins. I'm the director of the Science and Technology Studies program here at St. Thomas University. And I'd like to welcome you all to this, the fourth annual STS lecture. Not only to the people in Kinsella Auditorium do I welcome, but I would also like to welcome the people who are joining us online, because we are live streaming this event this evening. The live streaming has been made possible through a collaborative effort with the Situating Science project. Situating Science is a SSHRC-funded project that is aimed at building a network of scholars interested in studying science and technology from the humanities and social sciences perspective. Scholars from Canada and around the world. So I'm very happy to have established this link with Situating Science, and I would like to acknowledge the presence here with us tonight of the project coordinator for the Atlantic region. Emily Tektar is with us here this evening, and she's here to make sure that the live streaming goes on without a hitch, and to also field questions that may be directed to our lecturer after the talk is over. I'd also like to thank the Director of IT here at St. Thomas University, Dan Hurley, for all of his efforts in making this live streaming and the event possible. And last but not least, I would like to thank my STS colleague, Dr. Paul Burnett, who took on the lion's share of organizing this event. The STS program here at St. Thomas University is small, but I'm quite proud of the fact that St. Thomas University is the only undergraduate liberal arts university in Canada, to the best of my knowledge, that has a standalone program in science and technology studies. So we were absolutely thrilled when Stephen Shapin accepted our invitation to come and talk to us, because he has had such a significant influence on the field. History of science, history and philosophy of science and technology, on the sociology of science. He has molded a generation of scholars in those fields. He has challenged us and made us think. He's done this through his many articles, his numerous books, including the fabulous Leviathan and the Air Pump, Hobbes, Boyle, and the Experimental Life, which he co-wrote with Simon Schaffer. Other books by Stephen Shapin are Social History of Truth, The Scientific Life. Another one of Professor Shapin's books, published just last year, has arguably the longest title of recent histories of science, while another of his books has the best opening line. The one with the longest title is Never Pure: Historical Studies of Science as if it was produced by people with bodies, situated in time, space, culture, and society, and struggling for credibility and authority. The one with the best opening line is this book here, The Scientific Revolution, which begins with this sentence: "There was no such thing as a scientific revolution, and this is a book about it." It's that kind of writing that has enabled Professor Shapin to get people to think differently about science and technology in society. And his ability to do this has been recognized by a vast number of prestigious awards, including Guggenheim Fellowship, the J.D. Burnell Prize for Achievements in the Social Studies of Science, the Ludwig Fleck Prize of the Society for the Social Studies of Science, a Merton Prize of the American Sociological Association, and many, many others. He is currently the Franklin L. Ford Professor of the History of Science at Harvard University, and his talk tonight is The Long History of Dietetics, thinking about food, expertise, and the self. Please welcome Professor Stephen Shapin.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the extremely kind invitation and a very kind introduction. This is not an easy place to get to. You may be aware of this. I hope you're also aware it's worth it when you get here. I'd like to thank my host and especially Paul Burnett for the invitation. And it's a lovely trip. I don't recommend you make it in the reverse direction, but it's a long one as well as a lovely one. It's usually a courtesy to tell your audience what your talk is about. In this case, it's more than a courtesy. It's a necessity. It's not that most people don't know what dietetics is in the title. The problem is that they do, and it's not exactly what I'm going to be talking about. The word dietetics, at least in English, was once familiar to every educated person and probably to a lot of people who weren't educated or even literate. But people in our sort of society will generally suppose that dietetics must mean something adjacent to the currently very well-known term diet, as in being on a diet or doing the Atkins diet or doing the South Beach diet. That is the expertise involving practice of eating specifically to lose weight and presumably to gain in health and longevity and attractiveness to the opposite sex or to the same sex. That's what's in my students' heads when they show up for the first meeting of my class at Harvard called The History of Dietetics. I have to tell them that this is not a course about how to lose weight or how to live forever, and that's when many of them get up and leave. For those that are left, I then tell them what dietetics is and why it's worth some serious intellectual attention. It's, I say, a perspicuous site for science and technology studies, given the way things have developed in these fields. And it's a compelling site for anyone wanting to think seriously about the relationships between our bodies, ourselves, our place in the world, and our knowledge of bodies and ourselves and our place in the world. And not least, it's a compelling site for anyone wanting to understand what is the same and what has changed quite recently about the cultural schemes linking our bodies and ourselves and our knowledge. So what do I tell the students that are left in the room? I tell them that dietetics is a branch of traditional Western medicine. The other branches being diagnosis and prognosis, what was wrong with you, that's diagnosis, and what was likely to happen, that's prognosis, and therapeutics, what could we do about it, if anything, especially with respect to pharmacy and surgery. Unlike the other branches of medicine, dietetics was not a form of knowledge and practice called into play when you were manifestly ill, but something that was meant to maintain you in health. And so cognate terms that are just equivalent to dietetics are hygiene and, most interestingly, regimen. Dietetics, hygiene, and regimen, much the same thing. Now, both dietetics and regimen evoke, even to modern ears, some notion of order, an ordered way of being. Regimen, or a ruled manner of living, does this very clearly, but so does diet when you think of its etymology, which is in the Greek dieta, meaning a way of life. There are parliaments that are named diets, a day's order. So you should get out of the notion of dietetics, or diet, a sense of the quotidian, of the day-to-day, of the pervasive. And you should also get the sense of an ordered day, an ordered daily pattern of living. So dietetics is or was a part of medicine. And it's about an ordered manner of living through which you might hope to maintain yourself in health. That's to say, it's a body of knowledge that's mobilized to serve a practical end. You want to stay healthy, and presumably you want to live a long time. But it is, or was, at the same time, an important feature of traditional moral culture, an aspect of prudential or practical ethics. It sits astride what's often thought to be a boundary between the instrumental on the one hand and the ethical on the other, the scientific and the moral. So that boundary, the line reckoned to separate the worlds of description and prescription, of facts and values, of is and ought, is really crucial to our scheme of what scientific knowledge is and about how it's distinguished from other forms of culture. The long history of dietetics, for that reason, gives us a unique opportunity to see some of the conditions through which this boundary and our sense of what science is came to be established. What are some of the consequences of this establishment for the daily practices of the self? How did it come to pass that our sense of what is good for you, instrumental, came to be segregated from a sense of what is good, the ethical or the moral? That's the question. Modern scientific culture is a possession and practice of experts. And so we also ask how and with what consequences for the practices of the self did the knowledge of experts come to supplant lay knowledge of your own body and of the vicissitudes of aliment, food and drink, as it passes through your body. So what is or was dietetics? First, and while you have to acknowledge all sorts of modifications and qualifications and all sorts of variations, diachronic and synchronic variations, it was a remarkably stable culture. It developed out of the Hippocratic corpus of 4th and 5th century BC Greece. It was given its most developed ancient form by Galen in the 2nd century AD. And by the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, it had become something close to the common cultural property of every educated European, and probably, though this is less certain, it provided the vocabulary for talking about food, bodies, health, disease, and indeed, as we'll see, character for the laity as well. University-educated physicians were experts in dietetics, but they didn't own dietetic culture. It was too pervasive and it was too useful for a range of purposes for any one group to have ownership of dietetics. The dietetic part of medicine belonged to the fabric of everyday life, as its other parts, the other parts of medicine, diagnosis and therapeutics, did not. And just because dietetics was part of the fabric of everyday life, it belonged to you in a way that other bits of medical knowledge and practice did not. A physician might come to attend you if you are ill or if you are injured, but exceptional circumstances aside, you couldn't expect a physician to be by your side every hour of the day. And the culture of dietetics was. Dietetic culture was so pervasive and so useful in a range of human practices that it's not easy to understand its decline, why it went away, why I have to explain to people what in the world this thing was. If indeed decline and disappearance is the right way of talking about what happened to it. It's a question I want to raise at the very end. But by the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, the vocabulary of dietetic medicine that I'm going to describe in a minute began to lose a lot of its grip on expert culture, if not on lay culture. And by the mid-18th and early 19th century, a different vocabulary and a different set of expert practices began to take the place of dietetic language and dietetic practices within official medicine at least. So this is what you might call the decline of dietetics, meeting the upsurge of what might be called nutrition science. And this is a story that belongs mainly to the 19th century and into the 20th century and beyond. So those are some of the broad brush characteristics of the domain of traditional dietetics. And I want now to describe its conceptual vocabulary and what people did with it during the long history when it was culturally dominant, when everybody essentially knew this vocabulary. Now, the first thing that you have to understand is that dietetics is a special instance of an ancient philosophy of nature. It belongs within a natural philosophical setting. And this vocabulary, this scheme, has its roots in the work of Aristotle, so that everything in the world is made up of four elements: fire, earth, air, and water. And each, you'll see, of these elements has associated with it a pair of qualities: hot and cold, moist and dry. So the use of this vocabulary powerfully connected whatever could be said about our bodies and our food to the overall structure and processes of the natural world. When you talked about food and bodies, you were just orientating to a specific bit of the natural world. And the vocabulary that you use, for example, to talk about the properties of a burning piece of wood were the same as those you use to talk about the characteristics of a piece of roasted meat and its vicissitudes when you ate it. That bit of the natural world, which was your body, did have a purpose-built vocabulary appropriate to understanding it and ministering to it. And this is it. The fluid bits of the human body were made up of the four humors, in Greek chemoi, from which we get the root chemical: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or melancholy. In turn, each of the humors manifested a pair of qualities, so that blood was understood to be hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, yellow bile or choler was hot and dry, and melancholy was cold and dry. Now, this ontological vocabulary, this vocabulary, the stuff that exists in the world, the basic stuff that exists in the world, gave you a qualitative language as a bonus. That is, if you knew what things were made of within the scheme, you also knew something about their visible and observable characteristics. You had sensory access to the qualities of things. And you also had knowledge of what it was in the nature of things to be like or to do, of what their powers were. And when you talked about food, bodies in the natural world, you were using a vocabulary that was also deployed in talking about the psychological and moral characteristics of the self. It wasn't just that the humors each designated, for reasons that I'll explain, a personality type. So personality types in which each of the humors was reckoned to be dominant in different kinds of people. So you have here on the upper left a phlegmatic person. This is a person in whom the humor of phlegm is dominant, and you can see what these kinds of people are like, and you can infer what kinds of behavior they engaged in. And on the upper right, a choleric person, and on the bottom left, a sanguinary person in whom the humor of blood dominates. And finally, a personality type characteristic of students and professors, the melancholy person: miserable, cold, dry, solitary. So this is a very rich and resonant vocabulary, and it allows you to understand a lot of things, and a lot of things together in their relationships. Its intellectual reach and its reach into the fabric of everyday life was just enormous. Now, there are four things I want to draw your attention to about traditional dietetics. First, there's the way in which dietetics stood with respect to the distinction between the medical and the scientific on the one hand, and the moral on the other. Second, there's the source of specific dietetic categories and their instantiation. How did people know how to describe the characteristics and the effects of different items of aliment, of food and drink? Third, there's the question of self-knowledge and its reliability within the dietetic scheme. How one's own bodily experiences of taste, of digestion, of defecation, figured in making and sustaining dietetic knowledge. What kind of knowledge was this? And last, there's the question of what kind of self, with what relationship to both the natural world and to the body of expert knowledge, was inscribed within traditional dietetics, and how that sort of self was reconfigured with the decline of dietetics and the rise of nutrition science from the 19th century onwards. That's to say, if it's not to make too grand claims for this sort of thing, how the long history of dietetics serves as a marker of modernity. In traditional dietetics, health was understood as balance. You wanted to be neither too hot nor too cold, neither too moist nor too dry. Now, it's true that people's complexions, their temperaments, the sorts of things you see here, varied innately according to which of the humors was dominant in them. So there's a range of normalcy in those sort of schemas, and there was understood to be. So the ideal state of your body was exactly intermediate in all of the qualities represented by your four humors. But what was normal for a phlegmatic person who tended to be moist and cold was not normal for a melancholic person who tended to be cold and dry, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, and with the qualification for different temperaments, so there's a range, as I said, of normalcy, the intermediate position was considered to be the healthy one. And dietetic advice aimed overwhelmingly to deliver you to that position of balance and to maintain you in it. That's what dietetics aimed to do as a system of preventative medicine. If it failed, or if you refused to follow the dictates of dietetic moderation, then you became unbalanced. You became too hot or too cold, too moist or too dry, and that's what disease was. It wasn't a specific thing that got into you. It was a protean state of imbalance and the consequences of imbalance for your bodily health. And therapeutics, which could include change in patterns of feeding, so there could be therapeutic diet, sought to restore you to balance. You are what you eat. That's an old saying. It's widely attributed to the French gourmet Brillat-Savarin in the early 19th century, but in one way or another it goes back as far as you would like. Now, it was a matter here when you said you are what you eat of qualities and not of constituents. And again, I'd like to come back to that. It's a matter of qualities and not of constituents. And the condition for knowledge of qualities is different from the condition for knowing the constituents of food. Now, you shouldn't think of traditional dietetics solely in terms of food and drink. That's what I've been talking about up to now, but that's a bit of a misdirection. Today, diet, and for those that understand the term in its contemporary sense, dietetics picks out aliment alone, food and drink. But this was not the case in traditional dietetics. In fact, dietetics traditionally dealt with the understanding and regulation of aliment as just one of a set of transactions that you might have with the environment. Its reach was far wider than the management of food and drink. The repertoire of transactions which dietetics worked with was known from Antiquity through the early modern period, 17th and 18th century, as the 6 things non-natural. In the early modern period, essentially everybody could recite the list of non-naturals. So food and drink, of course, but also airs, waters, and places coming from the Hippocratic corpus, where you situated your house, what kinds of winds were good or bad for you, patterns of waking and sleeping, patterns of exercise and bodily exertion, evacuations, which included excretion and retention, quite a lot of material on how to defecate and how to urinate, but also included, this is very much a guy-oriented scheme, the evacuations involved in sexual release. And lastly, and from our point of view probably most oddly, what were called the passions of the soul, or what we would call the emotions. So these are the 6 things non-natural, and the management of these was coextensive with the ordering counsel of traditional dietetics regimen or hygiene. Notice that each of these things is not something that you were born with, and each of them is subject or potentially subject to rational control. So an expert could advise you how you ought to manage the location of your house, what sort of exercise you should take, where and how long you should sleep, and of course what you should eat and drink, with the idea that if you manage these kinds of transactions, if you responded to good advice, or if you mismanaged them and took bad advice, the consequences would be written on your body, and they would be visible in states of health and disease. It's this list of the non-naturals that allows you to appreciate the reach and penetration of dietetic medicine, because the management of these things, the 6 things non-natural, occupies a huge amount of your daily life. Much of your daily life can be parsed in terms of the management of these kinds of transactions with the environment. Again, where to situate your house, what sort of occupation to take up. When I talk about what sorts of things to eat and drink, this is a culture, as we'll see, that's enormously sensitive to the different qualities and therefore for the different states for humoral balance of each specific item of food, the combinations of items of food and the order in which items of food were taken, and the time of year in which it was good or bad to take certain items of food. So one way of talking about dietetics is to say that traditional society had a medical theory of practically everything about your life. And that would be true. But another way of putting the same point would be to say that traditional society had a moral theory of the body and its vicissitudes, health and disease, including eating and drinking. The list of non-naturals was just a pervasive organizing frame for early modern medical texts. So here are the things that you have to attend to if you want to maintain yourself in health and live a long time. But that same list of the things non-natural was an almost equally pervasive organizing frame in the Renaissance and early modern practical ethical literature. So if you look at book after book after book, which talk how to be a good gentleman, how to be a governor, how to be a prince, they are organized chapter by chapter in many cases in terms of the non-naturals. So they're the same thing. So here again, what was good for you, medicine, was also a formula for what was good, how to be a good and prudential and moral person. Okay, what sort of advice did you get in texts about the non-naturals and their management? Now, the counsel here was remarkably stable and consistent. Boring, too. You should observe moderation. Don't eat too much or too little. Don't evacuate too often or too infrequently. Take exercise, but not too much. Follow nature's dictates in sleeping, but don't stay too long in bed or remain awake when sleep calls. And if you follow this advice, correcting, of course, for your particular temperament, you're giving yourself your best chance of remaining well and living a long time. So temperance, moderation, was good for you, but temperance was also good. It was, after all, along with prudence, justice, and fortitude, one of the 4 cardinal virtues. Where extremes were vices, the position between the extremes was virtuous. Instrumental medical expertise wasn't, as we might say, in some sort of analogical relationship to moral advice. I want to say it was exactly the same thing. The golden mean was the position of virtue, and it was the way to health. Here, you are what you eat refers, of course, to body making, but also to the making of a moral self. In traditional dietetic culture, how did you know what you should eat and drink? The general counsel of moderation could be taken as given, but every individual was understood to be different, not just through possessing one of the 4 temperaments, complexions, but also by way of having a unique personal history of transactions with the environment. Custom, it was said, is a second nature. Habit is a second nature. And in traditional dietetics, that could be taken literally. Over time, habit had the capacity substantially to remake you. And that's one reason why physicians recommended almost universally that you not make any sudden change in your way of life. If you had to make a change in your way of life, for example, if you had become ill, you should take it very carefully and do so gradually. What you had got used to was in one sense good for you, and in another sense it just was you. Custom was a second nature. So by, in other words, following the dictates of the non-naturals, or by whatever idiosyncratic patterns of consumption, sleeping, defecation, etc., you had become accustomed to, that had become you. And that's so that the advice that physicians gave from with the Council of Dietetic Expertise always had to take account the unique you, both in terms of the kind of temperament that you possess, but also in taking into account your unique personal history, what you had become used to. Now, one route to dietetic knowledge was by way of expert practitioners, what they said and wrote. But expert physicians never possessed an exclusive authority to pronounce on what was going on with the particular body that was yours. From Antiquity through the early modern period and beyond, a popular saying had it, "Every man should be and was his own physician." It expresses a sentiment that set limits on an expert doctor's authority, but it wasn't necessarily motivated by skepticism about physicians' competencies or by hostility to their role. Just because the management of the non-naturals constituted such a large part of your everyday life, no other person could possibly know as much about you as you yourself. You were the person that knew about the personal history of your dealings with of your environment. And a physician could only know that by way of you. So the relationship between the physician's expert knowledge and self-knowledge has a much more constitutive and two-way relationship in traditional dietetics than it subsequently possessed. You should be your own physician because the best medicine was no medicine at all. It was a course of life that prevented you from ever becoming ill. And if you made a study of yourself and learned from experience what went well with you and what did not, then you would not just be an expert on yourself, but you would be the only genuine expert. In traditional dietetics, you could also be your own physician for reasons that had to do with the theory of matter, if you like, the natural philosophy and of humors that gave dietetics its basic philosophical vocabulary. Recall that your bodily substance, was made up of the same elemental entities, earth, air, water, and fire, with the same repertoire of qualities, hot and cold and moist and dry, as external nature, and that external nature, at least momentarily external, included your food and drink. Then it became internal, then it became part of you. What was good for you in general was aliment whose qualities matched your own temperament. If you were, for example, choleric, tending a bit towards the hot and dry, then foods that also tended towards the hot and dry should be your normal fare because they match the qualities of your own body. Of course, if you were ill, if your humors were unbalanced, then you needed to be restored to health by dietetic rebalancing. So someone who had become abnormally hot had to be restored to health by cooling foods. Someone who became abnormally moist, like a runny nose, had to be restored to health by consuming drying foods. But most people, most of the time, at least in traditional society, the question about today is an interesting one. Most people, most of the time, were not ill, and so the formula stood that you should eat what was like you, whose qualities were like your qualities. Now, how could you know what foods were good for you? There are, of course, lots of Renaissance and early modern books, commonly called dietaries, that typically went through a long list of foods, explaining which were hot and in what degree, which foods were moist and in what degree. There were 3 degrees of heat or moisture. And you could read these books and learn. The books were all over the place, and most people that had a few books in their house would very likely have one of these dietaries. So that's one way in which you could learn what foods were good for you. But you could also learn through the largely analogical modes of reasoning, inferring, for example, and I do this experiment with my students. I bring in a honeydew melon and say, what are the galenic qualities of this? And they say, I don't know. I haven't read the book. I say, come on, what is it? Well, they say, it's kind of wet, isn't it? I say, good. It's kind of cold, isn't it? I say, good. And so analogical reasoning can get you a long way, and arguably that's one of the important sources by means of which both experts and lay society could come to know what the qualities of foods were, and therefore what foods were good for them and what were not. Roast beef was hotter and drier than boiled beef. You have a group of people that don't know Galenic medicine, you can get them to a broad area agreement about the qualities of foods. I think that's probably one of the powers of dietetic medicine, is it piggybacks on the analogical modes of reasoning. Now, one way in which this knowledge could be mobilized, and mobilized very powerfully, is through the notion of taste. A Latin tag had a quod sapit nutrit. If it tastes good, it's good for you. Absent a dietetic natural philosophy, that seems either self-indulgent or incoherent. I think most people these days would rather infer that if it tastes good, it must be bad for us. But this is a scheme of things which will allow people to understand not just the sense of that saying, quod sapit nutrit, if it tastes good, it's good for you, but to understand the power of that mode of reasoning, because it's a power that is, as it were, available on your tongue and through the processes of digestion. Remember, your tongue is part of your bodily substance, and as such, it's made of the same stuff, manifesting the same disposition of qualities as the rest of your body. When the tongue encountered a foodstuff, its response was positive, I like this. If the food's qualities matched its own, or the tongue's response was negative, I don't like this, if they differed. The dietetic term of art for the positive response was agreement. Aliment that agrees with you, you see the sense of the term, is aliment that matches your temperament and is therefore nutritious, because it's kind of stuff whose qualities correspond to the stuff of your own body. Now, that's a very interesting state of affairs, and one that's rather different from present-day sensibilities. The tongue testifies, reliably testifies, to the fundamental compatibility between the qualities of aliment and the qualities of your own body. And you could also say that a food agrees with you if it was readily digested and came out the other end easily and in a proper form. Remember the evacuation. These are people who paid a lot of attention to what came out the other end. The experiences of agreement were philosophically framed, but as inner experiences available to you and no one else, they were understood to be uniquely available to you. Your expert physician might very well want to know what agreed with you, but by far the most powerful and reliable sources of knowledge that he had of this agreement was you and your testimony. Now also think about the conceptual language used in dietetic culture for talking about the relationship between the categories of experience and the categories of existence. Hot and cold, moist and dry, are, as I've said, qualities inhering in objects in the world, including those objects that form your aliment, and including those objects which are you. The categories of being and the categories of subjective experience are the same. Dietetic culture rendered the categories of sense experience epistemologically reliable, including those senses that Aristotle usually considered to be low and insensitive. Not just Aristotle, but from Aristotle through Immanuel Kant and beyond. The senses of gustation and olfaction and of touch, all contact senses, were considered to be low, not a proper model for knowledge, not discriminating, not consequential. But in this scheme of things, the tongue was thought of in specific circumstances as a philosophical probe into the constitution of the world, because it could know the qualities of things, it could report on the qualities of things. And digestion was an epistemologically relevant process, because it testified to what agreed with you, what qualities matched yours and what did not. Now it's probably, it's certainly wrong or simplistic for historians ever to say that any culture as pervasive as traditional dietetics ever disappears. We have too much talk in history of things going away or disappearing. Indeed, you'll probably already have recognized that some of the vocabulary of Galenic dietetics kicks around in our culture. Anyone that has found themselves knowing what melancholy might be or using the category of melancholy or biliousness or phlegm. By the way, my students in the class this year report that they don't. Or anyone who recognizes themselves, their mothers, their grandmothers, their grandfathers saying, this spicy foods don't agree with me, which my grandmother said quite a lot, is using the vocabulary that is handed down to us from the world of Aristotle and Galen and traditional dietetics. When we say that someone is hot-blooded or cold-blooded, similarly, we're using this vocabulary. And it should, I think, remain an open question what the continuing kicking around use of this vocabulary actually means for lay understandings of bodies, of aliment, of selves in our culture. I would simply say that we don't know. But as I indicated, sometime from the late 17th century and the early 18th century, university-trained physicians stopped using this kind of vocabulary of qualities, humors, and elements, or used it only in a marginal way. This is the world substantially brought about in the 1830s and 1840s by the English chemist William Prout and by the German chemist Justus von Liebig. By the time Liebig began working systematically on nutrition, his scientific inheritance included the doctrine of chemical elements ushered in by John Dalton, a generation before the expert world, containing oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, and carbon. Notice that the learned world continued to talk of elements, used the same word that Aristotle used, but the notion of an element had completely changed. Once water was an element, and now it isn't. It's a compound. Once all the elements were both available to the senses of a layperson with their qualities apparent, earth, air, water, and fire, and now very few of them are. So think, for example, of the difference with respect to our knowledge of the properties of Daltonian modern elements. If I say to you hydrogen, carbon, and gold, they have different conditions, different relationships between the conditions of your knowledge of their properties. I'll give you sulfur as well, and then I'll give you potassium. And if you just look at a list like that, you'll see that we have different forms of access, but the overwhelming number of elements in the periodic table now don't advertise their qualities because we have no direct sensory access to their qualities. Now for Liebig, 1830s, 1840s, the body is a chemical system, and nutrition and digestion are to be understood in chemical terms. Animal heat is combustion. Respiration is about taking in oxygen. Oxygen combines with carbon and hydrogen, and it passes out in the form of carbonic acid, CO2, and water vapor. Food is literally fuel. This is Liebig. With a proper supply of oxygen, we obtain the heat given out during its oxidation or combustion, which is to say, digestion. So the terms are changing, and they're changing interestingly and radically. Liebig's most celebrated contribution was to make a chemical distinction amongst elements, these are chemical distinctions, between those which fuel the body and those which built and maintained the body's fabric. The fuel bits were known chemically as sugars, starches, and fats, the first two of which soon were labeled carbohydrates. These were defined chemically in terms of the ratio of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and also, crucially for Liebig, by the absence of nitrogen. Nitrogenous element, which was renamed by another chemist around the same time, protein, built up the body's substance, though it too on occasion could be burnt as fuel. However it was called, these nitrogenous elements were also defined through the operations of chemical expertise. So we're now really in a world in which the basic properties of our foodstuffs are constituents defined by the operations of chemical expertise. In traditional dietetics, they're not. So I think you can see where this story is going, and so there's no need to do more than remind you some marks of its development in nutrition science and the study of metabolism through the early 20th century, led notably by the work of the American chemist Wilbur Atwater with the respiration calorimeter in the 1890s and 1900s. The calorie came to be established as the unit of alimentary energy content, with the body configured as a heat engine. The energetic powers of foodstuffs were defined through chemical analysis. The recognition of the nutritive role of compounds called vitamins can be taken back at least as far as the mid-18th century attention to scurvy, the origins of our understanding of vitamin C. These organic trace nutrients, then supposed all to belong to the chemical class of amines, were given the name vitamines, vital amines, in the 1910s. The achievements of modern nutrition science in identifying the nutritive components of foodstuffs and their role in the body are substantially indexed by one of the great and eloquent artifacts of the present-day incorporation of science into the functions of the state. It's this. This is the American, at least, nutrition facts label. And it's worth dwelling on this artifact, both as a telling indication of modern science-state relations and as a point of reflection for understanding the way we eat now and the ways in which we acquire knowledge of our aliment and ourselves. This is a different modality for you are what you eat. So consider the label. It tells us what our food contains, and indeed for nutritional purposes, what our food is. So many calories, so much fat, saturated and trans, so much protein, carbohydrate, cholesterol, vitamin A, potassium, and so on. The labels differ in different products. Now notice something about this representation. With perhaps one or two exceptions, the condition of knowing what our food is proceeds by way of the scientist's laboratory. You hold this knowledge, to the extent you actually do, by courtesy of and through trusting specific forms of external scientific expertise. You have no other way of knowing cholesterol, protein, potassium, or vitamin content. These things are not accessible to you in the way that, say, the coldness and wetness of a melon is accessible to you. Here you are not your own physician, and there is no way you possibly could be, since you rely upon expertise for your knowledge of what your food is. Now the exceptions, and I imagine you've thought of some exceptions, I think are only apparent: fat, sugar, and sodium, where you could say that the fat content of foods on the label is evident from their appearance of fattiness, that their sweetness indexes their sugar content, and that their sodium content is just another way of noting their salty impact on your tongue. But even these exceptions should dissolve, since we have little or no experiential access to kinds of fats, which appear on many nutrition labels, monosaturated, polysaturated. And a sweet or salty taste may, thanks to modern chemistry, be elicited by artificial sweeteners or by non-sodium salts. The sense of taste has here been, so to speak, philosophically devalued. And of course, so have been the experiences of digestion contained in the notion of agreement. The tongue and the nose are no longer treated as reliable probes into the nature of things, and we do not build our knowledge of alimentary content through sensory analogy, but through experts' reports of chemical analysis. To the extent we still say something doesn't agree with us, we often understand that this is a case for an antacid, correcting a chemical, not a humoral imbalance. Taste and smell experiences and judgments have been filed away in the cultural drawer labeled subjective, carrying the philosophical health warning that there's little to be coherently said about them. But this stripping away of philosophical significance from taste and smell has freed them up to do all sorts of other things in our culture. The removal of taste and smell experiences from the systems of making reliable knowledge of the world and of our bodies has made taste a scientific and philosophical orphan, but it has also made taste a suitable case for connoisseurship. And that's where connoisseurship lives, not in science. The taste belongs to connoisseurship and not to science. While the nutritional label is importantly the product of specialized expertise, its categories also, to some extent, have been vernacularized. So I don't think it's an easy matter to say that's external scientific expertise, and then we have the vernacular or lay sensibilities. Lay members of modern society, you and me, though clearly not all lay people, can parse the old saying, you are what you eat, through the expert vocabulary of nutrition science. And that's evident, for example, in the circulation in lay society of people watching their cholesterol and knowing their HDL and LDL cholesterol values, of knowing or inferring the cholesterol content of foods. We understand that we are what we eat in our culture, partly through knowing, through artifacts like this, the chemical constituents of foods, and accepting, at least formally, that these constituents undergo chemical transformations in becoming us. Our food is a bag of chemicals. We're a transformed bag of chemicals. We still say occasionally, you are what you eat, but none of the terms are what they once were. The you that eats what you are has been reconstituted through scientific expertise, a situation in our relations with aliment that is, of course, mirrored in many other aspects of modern selfhood, notably including sexuality, mental competencies, and characteristics. Modern selves are in part scientific products. That's our vernacular. We're partly scientific products. We are what scientists say we eat. The replacement of dietetics by nutrition science can therefore be taken as an instance of the submergence of vernacular or popular accounting systems to the authority of expertise. But from an interesting point of view, it is an instance of the extent to which expertise can and does constitute a new vernacular. It originates in the scientific laboratory, but it comes in part to belong to us, a way in which we make sense of ourselves and our transactions with the world, including what it is we choose to eat and drink. That's one way of talking about the power of modern science, and you're familiar with this genre of talking about the power of modern science and the way that it intercalates into all aspects of our everyday lives. But at the same time, this cultural transformation also testifies to the changing grip of expertise on quotidian life, and one might also say, I think plausibly, to its diminishing grip on modern life. Now that seems a paradoxical thing to say, the diminishing grip of scientific expertise, medical expertise on everyday life. If nutrition science helps constitute modern selves by passing them through the laboratory, how can you possibly say that nutrition science has less authority than dietetics? Now, I think there's several senses in which this is the case. First, in traditional dietetics, recall that the management of food and drink was just one of the volitionally controlled domains of human activity about which the dietetic physician advised. You might object that the siting of your house, the management of defecation, and the controls of the emotions aren't medical topics. But if you said that, that would just be to reassert present-day senses of what is and what is not medical. It's common to hear people refer to the modern medicalization of all sorts of human concerns, but it's arguable that medieval and early modern contemporary medicine reached much further into quotidian life, into everyday life, than modern medicine has even dreamt of. Indeed, you could defend the argument that modernity marks the demedicalization of life. Once medicine took charge of an ordered manner of living, now it has ceded almost all of that authority either to other sorts of experts, psychological experts, your rabbi, your priest, etc., or it's handed it back to the unencumbered modern self. which now feels itself encumbered with the responsibility of making these decisions. The second point follows from this. Not only did traditional dietetics take as its province a very large chunk of everyday life, it also had a powerful formula for telling people what they ought to do in ordering their lives. It was medicine with a message. It was normative. It was evaluative. Medical experts had immense moral authority. The dietetic physician could tell you what was good for you, and as we know at the same time, and saying the same sorts of things, what was good. And medicine could exert its moral authority without leaving the domain of medicine. That's just because what was good for you, as I've noted, was what was good. And again, just as moderation was a master formula for how to maintain health and live a long time, so moderation in the form of temperance was a virtue. We've seen that. The recipe for health just was the recipe for virtue. Medicine was morality in a somewhat different idiom, and the authority of medical expertise flowed importantly from the bootstrapping of medicine and morality. So finally, how from the perspective of dietetics and its historical changes can we describe the modern world, the world in which we live? First, there's the question of expertise and lay knowledge. The so-called withdrawal of high from low culture has been attributed to practically every age since the Renaissance, but there's a compelling case for its significance in medicine. You might be your own physician in a dietetic culture because the non-naturals were things an expert might advise on, but which only you could effectively report upon and manage. And you might be your own physician because your sensory experience of aliment, both taste and digestion, was considered to give you reliable knowledge of what things were like, their qualities. Neither is the case anymore. When it's said that modern culture has been medicalized, one thing it cannot mean is that we medically monitor our everyday lives more than polite society did, for example, in the early modern period. It's pretty clear to me that we do that much less. Second, I've tried to point out the ways in which instrumental advice, what was good for you, occupied much the same cultural terrain as moral advice, what was good. In talking the language of medical science, you were using the same sort of vocabulary and coming to the same sort of conclusions about right conduct as explicitly moral discourse. From that point of view, the sundering apart of the good for you and the good belongs to the same modern cultural move as the well-known philosophical identification of the so-called naturalistic fallacy, the claim that you could not and should not logically move from is statements to ought statements. Science is supposed to offer us means, not to constitute purposes or ends. If the ends by default are defined by the search of individual health and long life, then what's happened to the ethical framework once constituted by the virtue of balance and moderation, of balancing the variety, the qualities of foods so as to achieve moderation and temperance? An ethical framework that was oriented towards the conduct of the individual in society. You could say that it's disappeared, and that one sign of its disappearance is the extreme fad diet. I started by saying this is not about the Atkins diet or the South Beach, but one sign of the disappearance of the well-entrenched prudence of moderation, temperance, and variety might be phenomena like the Atkins or South Beach diet. Both of these would have been recognized in traditional dietetic culture certainly as bad for you because they're extreme, they're not balanced, and also as bad because they represent verging towards the extreme where vices live. But you could also speculate that dietary quackery is one side of a coin, the other side of which is nutrition science. When you move from the world of qualities to the world of constituents, protein, potassium, and so forth, you also move from a vocabulary once shared between medicine and ethics to one that has little or no ethical grip, and which does not have everyday ethics to balance it, to talk back to it. So here, a telling observation is not that the counsel of balance and moderation has disappeared, but that it has moved elsewhere in modern culture, with interesting consequences for its authority and its relation to expertise and to virtue. Your physician is very unlikely to advise anything as bland as balance and moderation. Certainly, I've never run into a doctor that did any such thing. A very few diet books do, but you can see why that's not a formula for a bestseller. Your mother or grandmother may tell you that sort of thing, but you never listen to them anyway. The late Julia Child counseled balance and moderation quite a lot, but she said it as a cook and with a full awareness that every time she threw a gob of butter into a sauté pan, she had to counter a shudder of cholesterol horror in her audience. So here are some influential, contemporary commendations of traditional medical and ethical wisdom, and they don't come from physicians, they don't come from nutrition scientists, they don't come from diet books or from chefs. Here is some assembled of real-life, modern, early 21st century expressions of dietary prudence to show that these kinds of sentiments are still kicking around in our culture. Number one, observe sound principles which are balance, variety, and moderation. The key to health is moderation. All foods are nutritious, taken in moderation. Eat sensibly, the assumption that a community of people would know through common sense what that was. A balanced diet consists of a variety of foods taken in moderation. And finally, mix together daily activity, motion and rest of the non-naturals, a sensible diet, and a little fun, the management of the passions of the soul, the emotions. This is a recipe for keeping your body balanced. So these are real-life forms of advice. So the question is, who says this sort of thing? They're all from websites, and here are their sources. The first is from McDonald's. The second is from Chick-fil-A, which I don't think you have. I couldn't find a Tim Hortons for you, but I tried. The third is from Hershey's of Hershey Bar. The fourth is from KFC, Taco Bell, and the last is from Pizza Hut. Because modern nutritional expertise has so little use for the counsel of dietetic tradition, it's left over in the culture, kicking around for anyone who thinks there might still be some credibility left in it. And so traditional counsel has largely become the property of agents in modern society who themselves have the least credibility and have been among the forces most disruptive of dietary tradition. Prudence now appears as an aid to profit. The once most authoritative dietary advice now a cynical attempt to link the bad and the bad for you to the good and good for you. In every case, the counsel of balance, variety, and moderation is just a click away from charts of nutritional constituents and calorie content on the websites. Tradition and modernity digitally side by side, and it's hard to think of a better index of modern attitudes to our food, our knowledge, and ourselves. Thank you.
Ask a question to Dr. Shapin. Perhaps think for a moment, or I could ask a question while you're thinking about what you might like to ask. Should I be I should be by the microphone. I'm not quite sure if this is Thank you very much, Dr. Shapin, for your interesting talk. I was thinking about the change from pre-modern to modern, and I was thinking about a pre-modern condition where the supply of food, can you hear me? The supply of food is erratic and cyclical, and a modern condition where a regular supply of food, an abundant supply of food is the ideal, right? And that's where we get into problems of superabundance. So I was thinking about the difference this way, that the consumption in the pre-modern condition it requires guidance for longevity and health precisely because there's an erratic supply. But the modern condition, the management of consumption is a bit different. And in fact, the management of the object of management multiplies. So you have a much greater concern for the management of production, the management of supply, the flow of massive quantities of food. And I think of the spread of the calorie as a measure of food, an understanding of nutrition in those terms associated with the needs of wartime mobilization and the development of post-war culture. And so I think about the consequences of that and the ways in which we might move from a concern with longevity and keeping people healthy and governing what they consume and the right way to consume and the moral way to consume, to a diffusion of concerns where you have a concern with production and flow supply. And the consequence of that is that imbalance becomes less of a concern. Right? So the imbalance of an individual consumer can fall by the wayside in the modern condition. And that's precisely why you have the Chick-fil-A saying that you need to eat sensibly while very much trying to pack as many calories in it because they want the appetite of the consumer to be stimulated to a large degree. So is there a kind of stakeholder argument in modernity where you have these different very powerful actors coming in and saying, yes, you should eat sensibly, but you need to eat a lot of this because we have it on hand, or we have it in storage, or we need to improve this flow because there are various interests involved in doing so. That would be a kind of pretty framework. There we go.
That's very complicated. No, I'm just trying to pick up a couple of threads of what you said. I would be very interested whether the sources of sentiments of this sort have passed them through focus groups. Given the size of the budgets concerned, it's very unlikely that they have not. I actually had a student who worked for McDonald's, and this is top secret stuff. So first of all, I'd like to know what it is they know about the economies of credibility of the relationship between knowledge of constituents and conceptions of balance and prudence that are actually kicking around in lay society. I mean, as I've said it a number of times, but not in this talk, I really think one of the most needful things is for many of us to make a move from the world of the scientific paper, the textbook and government testimony, to an actual systematic engagement with what it is, what the economies of belief about aliment and the consequences of aliments are in our society. So much of the design of things like the nutrition facts label or the food pyramid or now the food pie, etc., impute an information deficit to lay members of society and seem to be utterly uninterested in what kinds of possibly qualitative, distinct understandings literally we bring to the table. So I would respond to part of that by saying there's a healthy we do not know, and we really ought to know more of those things. Now, the question about pre-modern society, again, is at least bimodal, and it's probably much more complicated than that. The whole culture of advice about the non-naturals presupposes choice, and the truth of the matter, with some interesting exceptions, the overwhelming majority of people in Western societies, in fact in world societies, didn't have the luxury of choice. They didn't have the luxury of not eating seasonally. There was absolutely no choice in the matter. So on the one hand, there's a catchment area for you should eat roast capon and not boiled duck, which is not everybody, because most people are eating something called pottage, which is basically a bread soup with some greens and whatever salted meat you might have lying around. So the catchment area for choice is a small one, but the vocabulary for understanding the properties of aliment, the qualities of aliment, is much more broad than that. So there's a within the culture of people who are engaging with university educated physicians, it is people like us, because they live in a culture of abundance. A small fraction of the population live with abundance, is very much concerned with body management. There are epidemics of problems of indigestion and constipation and stone and gout that we can only dream of, that derive both from a culture of abundance and also, as we would now say, trying to reconstruct the diet of people like Samuel Pepys, of an incredibly high protein diet. So I think what I'm trying to say is, in response to both of your interventions, we need to parse both the pre-modern world, who's using the device, what are their dietary circumstances, what it is they're trying to achieve, and we need to have a deeper understanding of the distribution of belief and practices in our own society. That's the best I can do to that very rich suggestion.
The modern dietary prudence list that you have here is certainly part of the marketing plan of the McDonald's and all the rest. But it also not only survives, but has a renaissance in alternative models of health and healing that are part of contemporary self-care regimes and contemporary health-seeking behavior, and even the different elements of traditional, the Galenic model that you sketched earlier. So to the extent that all that stuff is still part of the culture and is something that at least part of the laity has access to, and at the same time we're seeing an increasing legitimation of a lot of alternative healing practices, do you see any scope for any of this moving back into medical territory? Or is the rise of the chemical interpretation of food so dominant that it could never be turned back?
Historians at their best don't answer these questions because it involves predicting the future. But what we can do, both historians and sociologists, is try to come in a richer and better understanding of where we are now. Because the best guess of what tomorrow is going to be like is it's pretty much like today. Or if we can see things changing over the last year, the best guess is they might continue to change over the following year. So, okay, on that basis, what can we say? It has been said that these are the best of times and these are the worst of times in all sorts of respects. There are more people concerned about and eating a healthy diet, including people who use language like this, than there were when I was a kid, and that's for sure. At the other extreme, the North American, the developed world diet under the not just the effect of the industrialization of food and of marketing and the ubiquity of food and the overabundance of it, but also the decline of the family meal and of cooking skills is worse than it ever has been. And, you know, we all know about the epidemic of type 2 diabetes. A suggestion might be that we will continue in our bimodal way. So people look around and say, all my friends eat local food from the farmer's market and eat seasonally. People probably don't have a wide variety of friends. That's my best guess. And on the other hand, you see people pronouncing fatwas on the appalling North American diet. But I compare, for example, what I and my family were eating when I was a kid in the 50s, and it is a lot better now from all sorts of respects. Okay, that's my guess. The sheer economic and political clout involved in McDonald's. McDonald's, I mean, at the risk of a lawsuit, you can get fresh salads in McDonald's, but they're there as a fig leaf. They're not intending to make money out of fresh salads. Will that continue? Will there be a lot of McDonald's and fuss over healthy versions or like this? Of course there will. It will mean next to nothing.
Yeah, no, I have no doubt that McDonald's will participate in this. I was wondering about medicine adopting that, any of the rhetoric.
What I worry about there is what many people regard as one of the great hopes of personalized medicine, and that's nutrigenomics. What I hope is that will be the successor scientific fad. And that has no use for the notion of balance, variety, and moderation or eating sensibly. That involves the further scientization of constituents for your genetic function. I'm cynical enough to think I'm not convinced that that's going to happen, but a lot of pharmaceutical companies and others are putting a lot of money in the hopes that it will happen, as, of course, they are the pill to lose weight. That'll happen too. Because, yeah.